Good morning, everyone. I'm Peter Katz, President and CEO of the Mountain View Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to our Back to Business series. As we all know, the pandemic continues to rage, as do fires and a few other natural disasters. But we've really been focused on how do we bring the curve down on the coronavirus. There have been a number of health orders that have come through, a number of ordinances that have come through. And sometimes it's confusing to know what the city is saying, what the county is saying, what the state is saying, what are the best practices, and how are we going to really handle things going forward. To help with this communication, we are delighted to welcome Tony Lopresti, Assistant County Counsel from Santa Clara County, and our own Max Moselle, Mountain View's Chief of Police, to enter in a conversation on what the orders are, what they mean locally, and what we see on the horizon. We encourage you to use the chat box to ask any questions. There will be a Q&A following some short presentations. And I just want to reinforce that this is an excellent opportunity to have both the city and the county share their perspectives and to hear from you. So we're very lucky to have both members here, and I'm going to hand it over to Tony.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Peter, for the invitation to attend today's meeting. I understand that the main focus of the meeting will be the urgency ordinance that the Board of Supervisors adopted on August 11th, and I'd be happy to sort of say a few words about that to provide context for it before opening it up to question and answer. Before I get there, before we started the meeting, I heard that a lot of businesses have been feeling like it's been tough to get in touch with the county through the COVID crisis. And I just want to say that we are certainly doing our best to create access and want to make sure that folks have access to the people they need to get in touch with in the county in order to get the answers that they need, or just to provide input. I think in creating the shelter-in-place orders since March and moving to the risk reduction orders, we're doing something that we've never done before, which is to legislate on a society-wide level in a very quick fashion. And so one of the ways that I think we've been able to get the orders right or better is by listening to folks on the ground to really ground truth what's being put into those documents. And we've been able to make a lot of adjustments and modifications based on what we've been hearing from the business community. And we really are eager to hear from the business community. To the extent that folks have something that they want to contribute today in the sort of category of a comment rather than a question, we're certainly excited to hear that. I would just point to a couple of other resources that businesses should be aware of. We have a business landing page now, have for about the last 6 weeks, where businesses can get information that's specific to them about how to navigate the COVID crisis, how to comply with the laws. There's also a business call line, which started up in, I believe, late June, where businesses can call and speak to somebody who has information specific to the business community. And we've been doing a number of presentations. I think I've probably, since March, done over 100 presentations to different industry groups and business groups. There's a number of other folks on my team that have been reaching out to business groups. So, to the extent you ever want a presentation as a chamber, or a business group that you're involved in wants a presentation or a discussion, we can certainly make that happen. So to the extent folks feel like they haven't been able to get access, I want to make sure that they're able to moving forward. So shifting gears to the urgency ordinance. I think it's important, before getting to August 11th, just take a step back and sort of see where we've come from. So in March, on March 16th, Dr. Cody issued the first shelter-in-place order together with 6 other Bay Area counties, as folks know. There were 5 iterations of that shelter-in-place order that shut down a lot of different businesses. There was sort of a slow reopening over time. On July 2nd, Dr. Cody was really the first health officer to shift the model from a shelter-in-place model to what we call a risk reduction model. And that risk reduction model opens almost all businesses, with a few exceptions for particularly high-risk businesses. And the idea is that it's important to, if we're going to reopen all of those businesses, reopen the economy, it's really important that we have mitigation measures in place. Those businesses have mitigation measures in place so that they're able to safely reopen, and we can get the entirety of the economy sort of back up and running because people have those measures in place. Our ability as a county to sustain a risk reduction model and to avoid returning to the shelter-in-place model where more businesses have to shut down really depends on broad-based compliance with those mitigation measures. So things like the social distancing protocol that the businesses have to fill out and implement. And in some cases, there are directives that are specific to certain higher risk businesses. People's businesses' compliance with those provisions are really critical to making sure that while we have a reopening, there's a reduction in risk associated with that activity. And of course, the orders apply also to people, to individuals, not just to businesses. So what the August 11th urgency ordinance does is it allows for more efficient enforcement of the public health orders. To date, most of the complaints and enforcement have happened through the DA's office in coordination with law enforcement agencies. But the main tool that they have had has been criminal enforcement, which in many cases is quite heavy-handed and inefficient. What the urgency ordinance does is it allows for civil enforcement fines. And this would be in the shape of a notice of violation that is issued to a business when they're violating any provision of the July 2nd risk reduction order or any other health officer order that's been issued. I think what's really important to emphasize is that the county's vision is to get voluntary compliance, and the vast majority of businesses, I think, have been willing and ready to voluntarily comply. We understand that the public health orders can be very confusing, especially when you layer on top of the county's orders the state orders, which in many cases vary from what the state is doing. And so there's a robust effort to make sure that there's an education process happening for businesses, that they're given an opportunity to correct violations. For the most part, the fines, the notice of violations are given with a grace period that allow businesses to come into compliance without those fines ever becoming effective. There are some instances where it's clear that the business is intentionally violating the orders or where there's an immediate and severe threat to public health where that grace period isn't offered. But for the most part, the idea is that businesses are going to get a chance to figure out what they need to do in order to comply, provided that they do it quickly. One thing I think is very important to emphasize as well is that in many cases, the business community has really celebrated this enforcement approach. And the reason for that is because, as I mentioned before, most businesses are making a robust, good faith effort to get it right, to comply. And it's very frustrating for businesses that are taking the high road and doing everything they can to abide by the law to see their competitors, which might be a small fraction of the industry, taking a low road where they're violating the orders and getting an unfair competitive advantage. And so, there have been a lot of businesses that have used this process to make sure that we have a level playing field, that there's consistent enforcement and consistent compliance across the board. And we really have been relying on the business community to point to instances where they're seeing, low road businesses that aren't complying with the orders, so that we know where we need to do our outreach and where we need to do our compliance efforts. So the early results, I think, have been really positive. There have been a number of notices of violations that have been issued. We've seen a lot better compliance. People are quickly getting into line, and our hope is that we'll see better compliance across the board, and it'll help us to get a handle on the COVID crisis, so that we can get our businesses up and running the way I know everybody wants to. So again, I'm more than happy to take any questions and happy to hear any feedback or input that folks have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony, for that. And I want to hand the mic over to Chief Moselle.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Good morning. Just kind of reiterating or highlighting Tony's presentation, the police department's approach early on in the pandemic, and it's been about, for us, we're counting about 160 days, has been to support the effort by the county to gain voluntary compliance. And with the exception, we've had about 500 responses to public health order violations over that period of time, the bulk of which were early into the sheltering in place, and I guess we would call it the phase 1 or stage 1 of the pandemic response. And it's been a conscious approach on our side to really advocate for voluntary compliance. And with the exception of just a handful of incidents, we've been able to obtain voluntary compliance, either from businesses or individuals who may be violating the health order. What's interesting about the policing of this particular situation is that, what is maybe more traditional, where we as a police department respond to an event, now we are in the middle of the event and have obligations to comply with the same health order requirements that any other business is required to abide by. So it's been a learning process for us as well. And we're alongside the business community, really trying to figure out the nuances and the complexity of how to best operate safely for both our staff and our customers as we engage with them both in our facility or in the community. With respect to kind of our city approach, the police department tends to get the central focus of what are we going to do with enforcement of this particular issue. And for the Castro Streets program as an example, it's really been a citywide effort. Virtually every department in the city, from community development to public works, police, fire, library, the city manager's office, finance, everyone's been involved in that particular program and has attempted to design it in order to ensure compliance with the public health officer's expectations. And our law enforcement efforts have been, again, really working with the business community and other city departments in order to educate rather than to engage in punitive citations. The civil order is interesting for us because we're not normally engaged in civil law enforcement. So we are involved with the county in a working group in order to determine what the best approach in how to support compliance with the order to ensure public safety, but at the same time being mindful of policing resources and the appropriateness of our agency's involvement with a civil enforcement effort. It's also important to understand from a policing perspective that on the heels of police reform and concern and roles of police in the community, we're very sensitive to wanting to ensure that our agency's resources are being utilized in an appropriate fashion and what the community's expectations are related to that, which brings a little bit more complexity to the decisions around how we are policing a public health crisis. So with that, I'm happy to turn it back to you, Peter, and open to any questions.
Thank you very much for that information. And I know that Courtney has a number of questions that were submitted in advance, but I want to just ask one really quick question of you, Chief, before we start, and just kind of get your sense of what you've seen out there. That is, have you seen a lot of violations, a few violations? I mean, what kind of have you seen as you've and your team has seen out there in terms of compliance?
So early on, we did have, as Tony described, kind of the issue of competitors and level playing field. We did have a higher quantity of responses to issues around lack of compliance by some businesses. And I'll separate kind of the individual issues with maybe mask wearing versus organizational issues around operations of business and industry. We see less of that now. However, what we are seeing, we are getting called to businesses, not for a complaint about the business, but businesses encountering customers who are uncooperative or challenging. There was a news story the other day involving a person in the city of Campbell, and we had encountered the same individual and a number of weeks ago, and those type of for lack of better words, confrontation or just refusal by certain individuals to comply with the business expectations of wearing a mask, and confusion around what an American with Disabilities Act or state provision for a person with disability may or may not have to comply with the order. And then police get requested to respond because of a disturbance call because of an argument over the issue. In terms of the individual compliance, especially around face masks, we have not engaged with that in an enforcement capacity. There was a lot of discussion about that. I think it would be very challenging. We have done a lot of compliance outreach and mask distribution. We've had a tremendous support, thousands of donations from the community that we've received. We've set up pop-up locations to distribute those masks and really focused on especially vulnerable populations, providing them with the masks and resources that they need in order to protect themselves and others as a part of the public health order.
Thank you. Courtney.
Okay. Well, thank you both so much for that great overview. I think it really helps businesses understand what's been going on. A lot of times as business owners, it's really challenging to keep up with everything that's been going on. I mean, everything changes at the drop of a hat every hour. So thank you so much for being here. If anyone has any questions, feel free to write them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I will be able to allow you to talk, and you can just ask your question if you don't feel like typing it out. To do that, you're just going to go to find your name, and you're going to click more, and you'll be able to raise your hand. In the meantime, while people are thinking of their questions, we did have a few that were submitted beforehand in the registration, so I would like to read those questions. So the first question was, and you did cover this a little bit, but could you go into more detail about what a business should do or the steps they should take if a customer is refusing to wear a mask? They claim they have medical reasons, but they look healthy and just walks past you without a mask. What should those business owners do?
Good. Chief, I can take the first shot at that if that's okay.
Sure.
Thanks for the question, Courtney. I think that's a really important question, and I think one that there's been quite a bit of confusion about, so I'm happy to address it. The requirement in the order and in the social distancing protocol is that businesses mandate that people wear face coverings when they're inside a facility, inside the business facility, unless they fall within one of those exemptions. So before we talk about the exemptions, let's just talk about what the business has to do. and what is not sufficient. So a business needs to be monitoring who comes into their business. In some cases, the directives require that they have somebody at the front door, like at a grocery store, but in most cases, there just needs to be somebody who's monitoring who's in the facility. So for instance, in an office space. And they need to actively require that people are wearing face coverings. So if somebody comes in and they're not wearing a face covering, somebody's got to go up to them and say, hey, sorry, the rule is you can't be in here unless you've got a face covering on. It's not sufficient to merely put up a sign that says face covering required. It's not sufficient, like a business was trying to do recently, to just offer somebody a face covering, and if they decline, to allow them to proceed within the business. You actually have to decline entry into the facility if people aren't willing to comply. So what about the very sticky situation when somebody says, I'm exempt because I have a medical condition, or I'm exempt from the face covering order. So in that,
or just says no because you just feel like it.
Yeah. So right. So let's take those two different circumstances. If somebody says, "Look, I've got a medical condition. I can't wear a face covering," at that point, the business has done its job. The business, for many reasons, including legal reasons, should not and need not say, show me the proof, or show me the license that you've got, or the medical note that you've got, or the doctor's note. That is not what is required or suggested of the business. At that point, the business is really taking that person's word at face value. And there's no more obligation on the business at that point. We don't want to create a situation where there's a conflict within a business about whether somebody's actually medically exempt or not, or has some other basis for being exempt. So, I think it's really important to understand that we are relying to some degree on people's honest representations. Are there going to be people that scam the system by creating, a fake certification, or falsely representing that they're exempt? Yes, that's going to happen, and unfortunately, that's just, I think, the upshot of the situation. I hope it's going to be very minimal, and by and large, people will comply. So let's take a different situation, which is that somebody comes into the business and just says, you know what, I don't like the face covering requirement, and I'm not wearing one. Well, in that case, it's up to the business to say, sorry, you have to leave my facility, right? It's not sufficient just to say, okay, well, you're good to go then, because in that circumstance, the business isn't enforcing the face covering requirement and is essentially putting other people at unacceptable risk within that business. Now we know that can blow up into a confrontation at times. I think that's where the chief would come in. It can get into a touchy situation. We haven't seen a lot of those, but it does happen from time to time.
And from the policing perspective, as Tony described the disability issue, medical issue, it's very analogous to what we deal with in terms of emotional support animals or service animals, which we've gotten calls to prior COVID. And you might have a person with a dog in a business, the business owner has asked them to leave, and they claim it's a dog for a disability, and we can't ask for proof, we can't ask or demand exit. If an individual does come into a business without a mask who does not claim an exemption, and you ask them to leave and they refuse, just like any other circumstance outside of this pandemic, the old sign of no shirt, no shoes, no service, you can add no mask to that. And if they refuse, you can call police, and officers will respond, and they'll contact you as the owner or your manager. And this is probably where your management and employees need to have clear direction, because the officer is going to ask, what do you want done? And the law allows that as an officer, we can demand a person leave a private premise at your request, and if they refuse, we can make an arrest. But we're not going to do so without the owner, manager, employee's direction that that's in fact what they want to do. I think in most instances, we're able to de-escalate the circumstance, the situation, and advocate for compliance and get the individual to leave. They may not be happy. There may be a lot of profanity or yelling, but typically the individual does go. But there are instances, more so not with the public health order, but with just everyday encounters in which we do have to make an arrest for a person refusing to leave a business. So that would be the approach we would take.
Thank you very much. That makes total sense. And, hopefully it doesn't get to that point where it does escalate, but you're right, it does happen. It can happen anywhere. As we've probably all seen a video or two of it on the internet. So thank you for doing the best that you can to keep the situations at a calm level. But, emotions are high these days, so sometimes that happens.
Courtney, if I can just make a comment on a few instances in which we've seen success. We've had businesses, especially some of the larger box stores, who've encountered situations, and they've actually offered, can we have someone get what you need and then help and facilitate the transactions so that we can get you in and out sooner than having you inside. So that might be a consideration as well. And, if your employees are adequately protected, and maybe there's protocols around that, but that might de-escalate the circumstance to allow for a more expedient resolution without an issue.
That's a great recommendation.
Good point.
Yes, thank you. We did have another question. Someone asked if you could go over the groups and maximum table size for households. I believe that's in regards to outdoor dining.
Yeah.
I believe, but you should look at the outdoor dining directive on our website, on the COVID-19 website, that the max size of a table is 6. What's important to note, and what has been a problem in the county, is that restaurants that are doing outdoor dining are not abiding by a couple of requirements. One is that the tables themselves have to be spaced at least 10 feet apart. And the other is that the people sitting at that table together have to be from the same household. And so what has been happening is that, people interpret the outdoor dining allowance to mean that they can get together with a bunch of friends as long as they do it at a restaurant. That's not what's allowed. That would be an unlawful gathering. And so you actually need to be limited to members of your own household when you sit down.
Okay, that's good. That's good to know. Thank you for that clarification. Are there any steps that restaurants can take to ensure they are following these guidelines? Is it up to the businesses to determine whether they're, roommates or not, or what's the expectation, I guess, from the city, or if the city or the county?
Yeah, I think the best practice is for the business to ask the question and accept the representation that's made.
Similar to the questions asked regarding the medical condition, right?
That's correct. We don't want people, we don't want businesses, asking for birth certificates or proof of address or something, right? There's a sort of line between what's necessary and what's practical. So, they should ask that question. And in terms of the tables, that's just something I think is objectively measurable. We've seen problems with it throughout. The other thing is, there does need to be face coverings worn, except for when people are eating, right? the risk associated with outdoor dining is that people are sitting in close proximity for a long duration of time. And so the way that we mitigate that risk is by, when people don't need to have their face covering off, they put it back on.
Right. And just to be clear, that means in the middle of the meal, when there is not food in front of you, you should be wearing a mask, correct?
Yes, right. So if you sit down and you're looking at the menu and chatting for 15 minutes while you order drinks and the waiter comes back with drinks, there's no reason to have the face coverings off at that point. Once food is put down in front of you, if you're a slow eater and it takes you 30, 40 minutes to eat your meal, so be it. You don't need to have your mask on, your face covering on while you're eating your meal, even if you're taking 2 minutes between bites. I don't have that problem, but many folks eat slowly, and that's okay. We're not telling people they need to sort of reattach their face covering every time they're chewing or anything like that.
Chief, this brings up a difficult kind of set of circumstance in that we want to be welcoming and we want people to feel comfortable, and yet if there are violations of such, we don't want to. Who's responsible for stepping in, or should they step in? What advice would you give both to the restaurant owners in terms of, how should we handle this kind of situation, and also at what point would your team get involved?
We hope not to get involved, to be the food police or the dining police. I think for us to respond, it would have to be something disturbing the peace or threat of violence. We're not walking downtown looking and using stopwatches. We do have city staff that have gone downtown and ensure the distance requirements are being met. The table requirements for distances are being met. It's a difficult question. I think some of the more effective response or approaches that we've seen have been when someone comes to a restaurant in particular, the rules are provided for them, the expectations are given, and the hope is that most reasonable people are going to be respectful and comply with the business rules and the county and state health orders based on that. I think the real challenge will be if you do have an individual who just outright refuses, and if it's more egregious, then the business owner may have to make a decision of whether they, again, similar to not wearing a mask in a business, refuse service based on that. But those are difficult circumstances, absolutely.
If I may, Peter, I think this is a really good example of that, of the utility of the urgency ordinance. The chief is absolutely right that that's the limited role that law enforcement would play. The real enforcement when it comes to restaurants comes through the Department of Environmental Health at the county, which regulates all food facilities. And it also now is coming through our business engagement branch at the Emergency Operations Center, which is responsible for compliance and enforcement. And so what is happening is that we're getting complaints that are coming in every day from people, from other businesses, from employees that are saying things like, hey, these tables aren't 10 feet apart. Hey, people aren't being told to wear their face coverings. All kinds of different complaints. Those are not necessarily being referred out to law enforcement anymore. In most cases, they wouldn't be. What is happening instead is that we have inspectors that will go out to those businesses and make a determination as to whether there's an actual violation. And if there is, the urgency ordinance and the notice of violation is issued to that business. Oftentimes, depending on the violation, there might be a call made first. But we have seen several circumstances just since August 11th where businesses, where restaurants are, hosting quasi nightclubs, for example, where they're allowing tables to be sat right next to each other, where the density requirements, because there's a whole layer of how many people you can have in a particular space, are not being abided by. So, most of the enforcement that we're going to see going forward is going to happen in that way. And, one thing to note for the restaurant industry is that there is a notice of violation, and the fines are quite hefty. They can be up to $5,000 a day. There's also a public posting of any violation that isn't corrected within the grace period. And finally, and probably most important, is that for any facility that's regulated by the Department of Environmental Health, a permit can be suspended or revoked that would prevent that business from operating at all if they don't come into compliance. And we've actually seen that not with restaurants, but with other types of businesses that are under the purview of the Department of Environmental Health, and they've just refused to come into compliance, and we've just had to take away the permit.
Thank you for that, and it gets into a broader question. Certainly, there are obvious examples. So, for example, if a table is seating 12 people and happens to be 1 foot away from the other table, those are very, very clear. And I know that a number of our small businesses are concerned about a number of things. They're concerned about, of course, the health and safety of both their people as well as our patrons. They're concerned about having a welcoming environment. It's one of those things, if it's too restrictive, no one will come. But they're also, cognizant too of, what are we going to be fined for, or what aren't we, and what course of action there is. One of the things that I found reassuring about the new ordinance was that it's kind of like a fix-it ticket. You have a chance to address the issue and then not have to pay the fine, rather than just then and there, boom, you're done. Sorry. I think that where it's those gray areas. So, for example, what exposure do they have if they have said these are the rules, this is what we are going to do, and yet you have people who won't comply? Are they going to be on the hook? Are they going to receive the fine, or is the person who's fighting the system going to be the one who's at risk? That's that gray area that I think is really causing anxiety, because that's something that may not be in their control.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so a few things to say on that. Where there's a sort of close call and everything indicates that the business is doing its best to comply with the ordinance, with all the public health orders, but just misunderstood it. That's where I think the education function comes into effect. And our enforcement officers would say, no, you've got it wrong. This is what the public health order says. You need to comply. And provided the business does it, then it would be like a fix-it ticket, right? There are a lot of businesses that'll try to exploit that leeway. So they'll, say, hey, I know I'm going to get a warning. I'm just going to do this until somebody comes out here and tells me I can't, and then I'll fix it. And then as soon as the enforcement officer goes away, they go back to it, thinking that they'll just get a warning again. And that's where the sort of fix-it ticket model goes away. If we're seeing repeated violations, especially of a similar nature, there's just going to be a fine without the grace period of the warning. And I think the same thing goes for intentional violations. So there's been a lot of media coverage, for instance, of businesses that say, we know what the order says and we're violating it anyway. There's it's not going to be a fix-it ticket for those guys, because there's no sort of good faith effort to come into compliance. The other thing, to get back to the very first thing I was saying, is there are resources available to businesses. I mean, you can pick up the phone right now and call the business call center, and somebody's going to answer and talk through with you the kinds of questions that you might have about the order. What's legal, what's not. If you're uncertain about some particular provision, you can also submit a question online using a web template. My understanding is that most questions get responded to within 48 hours. You know, at times, and again, to reiterate this, businesses are raising gray area questions that we haven't thought about yet, and we take back to the table and grapple with them. You know, there was a question just yesterday, for instance, about whether the state allows wedding receptions to occur. We know they allow weddings to occur as an exception to gatherings, but what about wedding receptions? You know, we didn't know the answer to that question. We asked the state got back to us and said wedding receptions are not allowed. And so we then communicated that to the folks that had asked those questions. We put it up as a frequently asked question on our website. We bring it out to the business community to make sure that that they're aware of that clarification. And that's really been the sort of iterative process where, you know, constantly sort of figuring out where those gray areas lie and trying to get clarity so that businesses can act with more certainty as they move forward through the crisis.
Thank you very much for that. I'd also like to add that the business call center number, as well as your website, is posted on our website as well. When we put it out in newsletters, we will continue to do that because we want people to use those resources. One other related question, you mentioned in terms of the gatherings and things like that. Are there other parts of the ordinance that in the general health, we've been focusing really on mask usage. Were there other parts of the ordinances that you wanted to touch on at all that you feel are particularly top of mind for folks?
Yeah, sure. So, what's important to note about the urgency ordinance is it allows for enforcement of any health order that's issued by the health officer. It even applies to the eviction moratorium that the board enacted. And so, anything that the risk reduction order says, that our testing order that was issued on June 10th says, requiring that large healthcare facilities provide testing to certain categories of people. Any one of our directives, the social distancing protocol, if any violation is occurring, the urgency ordinance allows us to take administrative enforcement action against those businesses. I think on the topic, well, there's a couple things I'd point out. One is the new order includes a really important provision that requires that all businesses report positive cases. And it also requires that businesses mandate that their employees are reporting to them when they have tested positive. That report to the county has to happen within 4 hours to the public health department. The reason that's so fast and the reason this is so critical is because our ability to contain an outbreak really depends on our case investigation and contact tracing, our special investigations group being able to track down where clusters are emerging, getting in touch with those folks, making sure people are isolating and quarantining, and ensuring that a small cluster doesn't become a huge outbreak. So the social distancing protocol now requires that all businesses have a process in place, a plan in place for doing that. It's really critical that folks actually
do it.
are careful with that, right? Yeah. We've seen a lot of instances where businesses aren't giving us the information we need to do our job in terms of case investigation and contact tracing, and it's really inappropriate. And that's the kind of situation where we're going to take really strict enforcement action because the repercussions from an epidemiological perspective are extreme. The other instance to your point is gatherings. So, the whole business community can do everything in its power to comply. And then you have, a place of worship that brings 300 people together indoors without face coverings, or a frat party, or a huge party in a park that, where people are engaged in sort of sporting activities that aren't allowed. What we've seen is that that's where we're getting huge clusters and huge outbreaks, and it really undermines our ability to get the COVID-19 crisis under control, in spite of the efforts that the business community is making. It's those kind of gatherings, those sort of prolonged groupings of people, oftentimes groupings where people sort of forget that COVID exists and they start hugging or they start drinking and getting really close to one another. That's where the danger is highest. And, it's, I think, particularly important that we get reports of those. We are going to be relying on law enforcement agencies and the DA's office oftentimes in those circumstances, just because our inspectors aren't able to get out that quickly to a lot of those events. Oftentimes they're happening at odd hours, 11:30 or midnight on a Saturday, for instance. But we do want to make sure that we get out to those as quickly as we can to prevent outbreaks from occurring.
That's very insightful, and I think that it's a reminder to everyone that social distancing isn't just what happens in a business. Social distancing has to translate into every part of our life, and social gatherings are an essential part of that. It brings up one last question, because we're getting close to the end here, but I hear this a lot, and I'll just ask it bluntly, and that is Santa Clara County considering a mandatory mask law?
Well,
I mean, I'm saying 100% time, rather than just, you don't need your mask when you're out running, or you don't need your mask when you're,
I see. Not that I'm aware of. I think the current ordinance requires that folks wear face coverings as mandated by the state, which is really restrictive. There are very few instances when you're out of your house where you should not, where you're allowed to sort of be out in the public without wearing a face covering. So, for instance, the way that the county order and the state order work, if you're on site at a business, anywhere really, you've got to be wearing a face covering. If you're anywhere where, outside and not on a business where you might be within 6 feet of each other, say walking down a sidewalk where there's quite a few people, you need to be wearing a face covering, right? The instances where you don't need to be wearing a face covering are like being out on a hike, right, with your family, if you're actively exercising. But for the most part, folks should be wearing a face covering. And, I think our hope is that the sort of peer pressure effect is really starting to settle in. I think we're seeing more and more people wear face coverings. A lot of folks, it's getting to the point where you kind of feel like a heathen if you don't have your face covering on. And I think that's where we need to get. But I'm not aware of any sort of initiative to say, look, if you're outside of your house, face covering on, start to finish until you get back in the door. I'm not aware of anything going that far, just at least.
I want to ask Chief Bozell if he has any last comments that he'd like to make too.
No, I think, very unprecedented times. Certainly, I heard the analogy of the trifecta, where the 1918 Spanish flu, the 1929 Depression, and the 1968 Civil Rights riots all come in together in 3 months, 4 months, and now we have fires at our mountaintops, smoke coming in and making it even more problematic. And I just want to call that out with respect to, we're all facing those challenges together. And it's my intent that as a Mountain View Police Agency serving the Mountain View community, that we work together in order to overcome these challenges. And reach out to us if you have any questions. Lieutenant Armando Espedia is our contact. The county's been very good at working with us, and we have direct communication. So if there's issues or concerns, we're here to facilitate and answer questions and respond to any of your public safety needs. Thank you.
Excellent. With that, I want to thank both of our panelists very much for their time today, for your thoughts, for your advice, and especially for the hard work that you're doing every single day. It's not easy right now. As Chief Bozell was saying, it's unprecedented in terms of all the forces that are acting together. And as Tony, you've said, we're learning a lot as we go. This is just uncharted ground for many of us. One of the things I will say that I've been most impressed with is the grace of the community. That it does seem to be a general sense of we are in this together and we need to be sensitive and help each other. And so again, these presentations that we've been doing and the work that you're doing are all designed to inform and encourage dialogue. So thank you very much for being a part of that. I'd also like to add that we do have these resources listed on our website, but we'll continue to also send them out via our newsletters and social media. And we've just posted on in the chat room that next week's Back to Business session is taking signups now, when we'll be talking about outdoor business operations for the entire city of Mountain View, not just for downtown. So again, thank you all very much. Courtney, any last comments?
No, just thank you so much for being here, to our two speakers and our attendees. And we hope to see you back in the future.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.